This happened in 2003. I was 8 years old at the time, but I remember most of what happened due to the fact that it was crazy. It was Labor Day, and we went camping to this place in Virginia. My dad invited his friend and his wife. These people are the grandparents of my best friend. I was like most kids who couldn't appreciate nature, but there was a place in the campground with a bathroom and some arcade games, and I would bike there to play all day. It was about a 10-second bike ride from our tent, so my dad let me go by myself. The path to the arcade was a gravelly type of hill, with a lot of small rocks. So I try to go up the hill, and my back tire loses friction, and the bike starts to lose control and I fishtail to the right. I panic because I'm only 8, and I have no bicycle skills. I end up crashing into a white van. The right bumper had a huge black scuff mark. I don't see the owner, so I pick up my bike and get the hell out of there. We were only at the campground for about 3 days. I don't remember which day I hit the van, but it wasn't the last day. On the last day of the trip, we were packing our stuff in the car to go home. I didn't help at all because I was in the car drawing with my new Crayola Twistables, and I know exactly what I was drawing. It was butterflies, because early that week in school they taught us how to draw them. You make a snowman, and then you put 2 threes on both sides, and that's a butterfly. So I'm drawing when all of a sudden, I hear the loudest noise of all time. It sounded like a firecracker blew up right behind us. I get out of the car, and I see my dad's friend stumbling with a bloody mess at the bottom of his leg. His foot was still attached, but it was dangling. He lies down on a picnic table. There's blood everywhere. It was dark red and thick like syrup, and had a lot of bubbles. At this point, there's a circle of people surrounding my dad's friend, Bob. I hear a crack, and I look to my left, and I see this huge black guy, fat and has glasses. He cracks his gun in half, and dumps out 2 empty shotgun shells. He turns around and walks towards the white van. He walks right by the black scuff mark, and pulls open the door. The only thing I could see were boxes and boxes of ammunition. He grabs a box, pulls out 2 more slugs and reloads his gun, and just stares at everyone. It's pretty selfish, but the only thing I could think of was, I hope this isn't my fault. I crashed my bike into this guy's car, and now he has shot our friend. Maybe I started this. I remember the psycho yelling,
"Don't ever ask where I'm from."
My dad makes a full-on sprint towards the guy, and my mom had to yell, "He has a gun!" before my dad snapped back to his senses. He stopped and stared at the shooter, and the shooter stared back. My dad goes back to Bob. He takes off his shirt and puts it on Bob's bleeding leg. I don't think my dad knew what he was doing. I remember everyone retching and gagging, but nobody is really moving. We're all waiting for something to happen. Then 2 off-duty cops subdued the perp. Bob ended up losing his foot, and he got a bunch of money from the bad guy, I think. The shooter ended up being declared insane. I do remember seeing him in the cop car when some other cops arrived, and he was rocking back and forth. I'm pretty sure the guy shot Bob for no reason, but maybe it was because I wrecked his bumper. So I guess a little background. I'm a Jersey native, sadly, born and raised, and I was about 12 or 13 when my entire family went camping in the Pine Barrens, which is where it's said to be born. Ever since I was little, I've been into occult stuff, so I already knew about the Jersey Devil. And I was one of the oldest cousins, so I can't tell you how many times we searched for the cabin that it was born in. Also, I should mention that we used to camp there a lot, but less and less as we got older. So I remember it was the first night. We'd usually stay about a week. And I know we watched the movie Coraline. It had just come out and I loved it. I'm mentioning this because I had a pretty fun night before I encountered it, so it wasn't a nightmare-induced hallucination or anything. Another thing you should know is that my family didn't actually like to camp. We had RVs, so it's just my dad and I in our camper. It had one bed in the back, and I slept on the couch that pulled out to be another bed. My dad closed all the blinds we had, and I was next to the biggest window in the camper. So little me is asleep and happy, and then boom, I wake up from a crack of thunder. It was so loud and I couldn't go back to sleep, so I'm just laying there listening to the storm. The lightning was frequent. This is when I hear something. Footsteps. I thought I did, between the claps of thunder. They started off quiet, and of course got louder and louder. Got closer. I'm still really not thinking anything yet. I mean, I was freaked out, but maybe it was an animal, or just the storm playing tricks on me. In a matter of seconds, it was like, oh fuck, not the storm. Mind you, I'm facing the window, so I could look up the blinds and see a tiny bit of outside. This is important info, because that's when this thing came up to the window. I'm shitting my pants, barely breathing. In my head, I'm like, what the hell just stomped up to our RV? Again, this all happened very fast, and the lightning and thunder hits. Boom! It looked like a horse was looking into the RV. Honestly, typing this, I can still hear it breathing on the glass. I stopped looking up the blinds, hoping that it doesn't see me, and when lightning strikes again, I see the shadow, almost as if lightning was striking directly behind it. It definitely had the head of a horse, but it looked like it also had spiral horns, which made its head look weird, and I was terrified. Also, please remember, I was only seeing what I could from lightning striking. It starts to make its way towards the front, and like I said, all our blinds are shut. So as soon as I heard those loud-ass footsteps going to the front, I crept into my dad's bed. I laid down behind him, and didn't want to make too much movement, but I was shaking him, trying to wake him up. He said something like, "Nick, just go back to bed." He knew I wasn't a fan of storms, so that was probably his first half-asleep thought. Just to paint a clearer picture, I'm against the wall behind my dad. There's a window in front of him, and one at the top of our heads. The footsteps were coming to the back, and when the lightning struck, I can see the shadow of the ears and the horns again. It was there, looking in. And like I said, I can still hear that motherfucking heavy-ass breathing, 'cause it was terrifying. The most confusing thing is that when it left and headed towards my aunt's campgrounds, so did the storm. Maybe that's what it does. Maybe it creates the storm somehow, so that I can still be stealthy. I've dealt with people who have led survival camps, and I've spent years in the Pine Barrens, with no signs whatsoever. But that's what's so intriguing in my opinion. I mean, if it is an entity, it could probably make a storm if it wanted to. So as it left and the storm calmed, I finally got back to sleep. In the morning, of course, my dad and aunt didn't believe me. And going outside, the ground was semi-wet, but I remember that there were no footprints. And another thing about this RV is that if it was just some nasty horse walking around, it would have to be at least 8 feet tall to look in the windows like that, unless it was standing on its back legs. That was my big argument to my aunt and dad on why there was no way it was a horse. I will never forget that camping trip. For reference, I was a 19-year-old female at the time. Still female, of course, just a little older. I love camping. Anytime my friends and I came home from college, we would load up our cooler with beer, grab some gear, and go screw around outside. Unfortunately, when I was actually at school, none of my sorority sisters or other friends ever wanted to go with me, so I would often suffer withdrawals from camping. One day the weather was way too nice to waste, so I grabbed some of my gear, hopped in a car I borrowed from a buddy, and drove to a spot that was secluded yet within a safe distance to civilization, so that I could run and get help if I needed to. Camping also creeps me out sometimes, but that creepy feeling is also somewhat of a plus. It's the same reason that people read these stories. It's fun to be scared, so I make a little camp and get a fire going. I hadn't brought all that much to eat, but I was enjoying myself, reading and looking around the area, that sort of thing. I got the feeling I was being watched, and I stopped dead in my tracks. I hear a twig crunch over to my right, then see a doe bolt from 100 feet or so in front of me. I laughed at myself and went back to the camp with the armful of wood I had gathered. I kept freaking myself out, hearing sounds just outside the ring of light cast by the fire. I always get inside my head, so I shrugged it off and kept whittling a stick I had been messing with. Around 1, I decided to go into my tent and snuff out the lantern. I'd been slamming beers in the most unladylike fashion. Another reason I like camping. I can act however I want. I passed out pretty quick. A bit later I wake up. I hear footsteps. They sound pretty light and sort of timid. I think to myself that it's a deer or other animal. Maybe a raccoon because I probably left some food out. I'm still on guard though. After about 30 minutes of sleeping with one eye open, I hear a rubbing noise, and the tent fabric is being pushed in a bit. I don't know how I didn't shit my sleeping bag, but I just sat there, paralyzed with my K-bar in my hand. I desperately wanted to thrust the knife through the tent fabric, but I was still holding out hope that it was some of my buddies, joking with me. And then as suddenly as it had began, it all stopped. I was starting to feel slightly more secure, because daylight would be coming in about 2 or 3 hours, but I sure as shit wasn't going to go to sleep. All of a sudden I realized I should put my boots on, so that if anything did happen I would be ready. After having stayed up and keeping alert for a little while longer, my friend's car alarm goes off. I freak the fuck out and run out of the tent. I got about 2 steps before something grabs me around the mouth. I opened it to scream, but instead, the person's pinky finger slips between my teeth. I've heard that people can perform superhuman feats when they have huge adrenaline rushes. In my case, I just clamped down. And there's no way to say this without sounding ridiculous, but his finger just popped off. He screamed, pulled his hand away with the missing digit falling to the ground. He took off running down the hill, and I took off in the opposite direction. I must have looked ridiculous to the people whose house I ran to. A little sorority girl in a wife beater, boxers, and steel-toe boots. I also had some blood on me, and not just from the finger. I had managed to take a pretty good chunk out of my lip as well. I told them what happened. They called the police and got me some real clothing, and the guy made me a whiskey and coke. The cops went to check it out, and when they came back the sun was up. They brought me there so I could get my friend's car, and what I saw just terrified me. Right next to the tent was a red gas can. He could have just lit me on fire. The finger was gone. The kicker is they never caught the guy. So somewhere out there is a man sitting down to dinner. Maybe alone, maybe with a wife and a couple of kids, and he's missing his right pinky. Have you guys ever seen the Texas Chainsaw Massacre? Many of you probably have. But for those who haven't, it's your run-of-the-mill slasher horror flick made in the 70s. It's considered one of the best horror films ever made. When I first watched it, it seemed to really hit home for me. Much more than it did for my brothers when we were younger. I was 11 at the time, and we had sneaked a copy of it into our house from our friend who lent it to us. Now I'd have to say that one of my biggest fears is being kidnapped, and being surrounded by inbred batshit crazy people. So when I saw this, there were more than a few sleepless nights with my light on. But what are the chances that you would ever find yourself in a situation like that? Let me tell you all. This will serve as a warning to anyone who thinks that the United States doesn't still have its fair share of crazies. Listen to me right now. There are people out there who live in the woods. There are many of them, and I'd bet that there are some that live in your state, and they could potentially be the most dangerous people you could ever encounter. They are not to be tampered with. If they find you on their turf, and God forbid capture you, you'd be better off dead. When groups of people begin to isolate themselves for a long time, eventually participating in interbreeding, they become something different than a human. Their primal instincts and violent tendencies become amplified, and their intelligence and empathy become non-existent. I'd like to tell you about my most terrifying experience, and my first and hopefully last encounter with people like this. So it started over the summer. A few of my friends and I decided we wanted to go on a camping trip. Weird, right? 4 dudes going into the wilderness with no girls and sleeping in tents. Well, we used to do this when we were kids, so it was kind of a nostalgic trip. It would always be an annual night of fun in the outdoors. We would drink, tell stories, laugh, cry, the whole deal. We live relatively close to the woods, so our parents would let us go, but only once a year. So anyway, back on topic. It had been 5 or 6 years since we last went up there. We all parted our separate ways when we went to college. We would occasionally all go on Facebook to talk about our lives. So we all finished college, got jobs, and I decided to call them up. I managed to get a hold of 2 of them, and they were both up for it. My other friend moved all the way out to Florida, and he was busy with work and shit, so he couldn't come back to our home state. We brought a bunch of gear and supplies, beer and food. We were ready to relive our high school days as best friends. We got onto the trail at about 5 p.m. I swear it was like we were back in high school. We talked about everything happening in our lives. We were laughing so hard at the college stories we were practically choking. We finally got to our place at about 8 p.m. We were all set up by 9 and we lit up the fire and cracked some beers. We talked for about 3 hours, and we decided to call it a night. Now, there are many rumors in my area about these people who have been isolated for some time now. We had never seen any sign of them when we were younger, so we never worried about them. I don't know if they relocated or moved or something, but basically what I'm trying to say is they should have never been there. They should have never known we were there. I woke up in the middle of the night and looked at my phone. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and for some reason I couldn't sleep. For about an hour, I just laid in the tent, staring at nothing. And that's when I heard it. Not it, actually. That's when I heard them. It sounded like a pack of wolves or something, walking around our spot. I was already losing it at this point, but when I really shit myself was when I realized they didn't sound like animals. The way the steps were moving and the breathing patterns were just too human. There was no way they were animals. I stayed absolutely silent. There was no noise for a brief period, and then I heard whispering. The only thing I could make out was,
After we gut them fuckers.
at this point, my fight or flight instincts kicked in. It was officially go time. I nudged my buddy to wake him up. He just turned around and looked at me with eyes that said, "What the fuck?" I put my finger over my mouth and motioned with my hand that we needed to go. He nudged the other friend, and we could clearly hear them talking now. We all stayed absolutely still for 30 seconds, and I took out my Swiss Army knife. I got out my phone for the flashlight, and I was ready to bolt. Then we heard one of them scream.
Them fuckers are awake.
I immediately jumped out of the tent, and I got one good look at all of them with the light. They were disgusting. Their teeth were all deformed, and they had huge heads. Their ears were gigantic and perked up like a dog's. They were all much bigger than us. I would guess that they were like 6'4". We hauled ass out of the area as fast as we could. We left everything. We could hear them chasing us, cackling as they were trying to track us down. My adrenaline was at maximum levels. After about 2 hours of running downhill, we finally jumped in the car and called the police. We told them everything that happened. Here's what the cops said in response. "This happens frequently in this area. Just don't go back there." What the fuck? I explained to him that they were about to skin us alive, and we left all our shit out there. All he could say was, "I'm sorry for your loss, sir, but I would advise you not to go back." I was in complete shock. I've done a lot of research since the incident, and there have been many cases of missing men, women, and children in surrounding areas. A lot of nights I lie awake in bed, thinking about what would have happened had I fallen asleep, but maybe writing this might give me some closure. Hey guys and ladies, thanks for watching. If you want me to tell your story, or read a creepypasta, email me at the address in the description. Be good to animals, even people. See ya. What the fuck? Holy shit. Great, I'm gonna be killed by a bear. What is this asshole doing? No, not my guitar. Whoa. Nobody's gonna believe this. Oh man, my nan gave me that. How the hell am I gonna get out of this? Eventually it's gonna come over here. Fuck it. Alright, bear, listen up. My name's Corey and I'm inside the tent. Okay, take it easy, sir, or ma'am. I just want to make a deal with you, that's all. That guitar playing was impressive, by the way, with those big-ass claws you got. But just hear me out. If I split all my beer with you, will you let me live? Cool.
Ja, snäll mal. Bergsbus. Rish.
And then I hate when then people, well, we're just friends. Dude, why do you think he started hanging out with you? Because he liked you? He fucking liked you is why.
Yeah. Yeah, that's crazy.